We are honored to have Professor David Lazer here from Northeastern University. He is the university's Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer Sciences at Northeastern and co-director of NU Lab for Text Maps and Networks, among many other things, such as the COVID States Project and the new National Internet Observatory, which I'm sure he'll talk about. I'll say one of the things I really appreciate about David is how much service he is doing to the discipline. He is providing infrastructure, public goods for all of us who want to study the effect of social media on politics and on life. And he's doing it not just in the context of social media, but the COVID States Project is being used pretty much by everyone to track all issues related to COVID. So as with all of our workshops, Professor Lazer will talk for about a half an hour. Those of you on Zoom, feel free to put some questions in the Q&A and then we'll get to my phone when we are up here. And then those of you in the room, just raise your hand if you have any questions. With that, welcome Professor Lazer.
For the generous introduction. Thank you all for coming and spending this hour with us. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm actually going to talk, this will actually be two talks, they're sort of interrelated. The first part of the talk is what you see here, the emergent structure of the online information ecosystem. The second, shorter talk is going to be on the National Internet Observatory. Like Nate mentioned, a large infrastructure project that I and colleagues at Northeastern are leading. And I'm just trying to get the word out about it because the idea is for this to be used by scholars outside of Northeastern University, and this seems like a good audience to discuss the prospects of use of those data. So, so let me actually take my watch off so I keep track of my time because I could easily spend my whole time just on this first part. So I'm gonna, I'm not going to dig into all the methodological details, which there are many, because otherwise I'd never get to my second talk. But obviously, great to talk about those details if you have questions. And the other thing I should warn you is that this is actually an amalgam of a few papers and projects, and I'm trying to think about how this forms a bigger picture. Hence the term, hence the phrase. I'm trying to turn this into more of a book type of vision, and so that's sort of what you see here, but it's very much still in the first pancake stage, which can be a little messy, so hope you'll forgive me. The other thing is I should acknowledge the many people who have worked on projects and pieces of this, including Ron Robertson in the back row there, who was a postdoc here, and who did some foundational work, which some of which I'll allude to, and other of which is working still. So in any case, this is the work of many people. So in many ways, I think we've all contemplated the impact of the internet on democracy. I think there have been a lot of concerns, in particular, about the possibility of echo chambers and filter bubbles, that somehow the internet is allowing us just to communicate with people like us. This was raised by Cass Sunstein, Reiser in the filter bubble stuff. This has come up repeatedly, but the empirical work on looking at how people behave online actually suggests that most people consume most content from pretty diverse sources and pretty mainstream sources, and that the concerns about polarized news consumption is really not come to full fruition. Not to say it's not there, but it's also not as compelling an empirical pattern as many of the theorists argued in earlier years. So I'm going to try to address those questions in a way I'm going to say both parties are right and wrong in certain kinds of ways, and start from the big picture question of clearly how we access political information has changed over the last generation, and the question is what are the emergent implications of those changes in information act. I'm using purposely the language of complexity, which is that we're all making choices, meaning both consumers and producers of information, circulators of information. There are many actors here who are making choices at the same time, and the question is, when you put all those decisions and interdependencies together, what does it look like? And I think at the foundation of all of this is around the choice that the enhanced choices that news consumers have. And so this has a few implications. One, and I'm going to discuss this, and this is sort of in some sense the core of the argument, that our choices, the fact that we have choice naturally leads to a concentration of producers of news. And I'll discuss why. And that's going to create naturally some degree of increased homogenization in news consumption. Just that's a natural artifact. If you have fewer outlets producing and fewer places where we're paying attention to that are producing national news, in particular not local news, but national news, that will inevitably make us all look more alike in some way. On the other hand, there is a sort of curation process by which all of that content, and this we all get to choose from many more things than we could have a generation ago, creates a heterogeneity of consumption of news content, which is different from the notion of heterogeneity of consumption of outlets. There's an increased homogeneity of consumption at the outlet level, arguably, but an increased heterogeneity at the news story level. And so that's how we can look on the one hand like we're more similar in some ways in terms of the outlets we're consuming from, but more different because we're consuming different content from the same set of outlets. And so I'm going to walk through documenting some of this. If we were looking back, this is from the American Newspaper Directory from, I think, the late 1860s. If we were thinking about news consumption in the 1860s, it would have been, what we would have had is, in some big cities like San Francisco, we would have had a ton of choices, but most of the country wasn't in big cities and would have had maybe a newspaper that they would have had access to. So there's a way in which people in the late 19th century were living in pretty small bubbles, meaning that they had a choice of a news outlet. It gets a little bit more complicated, the way news circulated among outlets and so on, which was very different from today because, for example, newspapers could just copy each other. There was no IP protection in the 19th century. So let's see. Is this good now? All right. Let me know if there are issues. Sorry about that. So the reality of the late 19th century was very little choice in terms of news consumption. You might have, for most people, for some people, if you're in New York, if you're in San Francisco, you had quite a bit of choice, but in most towns, you had very little choice of news consumption. So, that has obviously evolved considerably since then. But this is in a way, when we think of the early days of the news media, newspapers in the United States, there wasn't a lot of choice. So if we think more generally about how we consume news and the patterns, we can think about how we consume news on newspapers, what broadcast news consumption looks like, and then the internet is really a medium of many media, right? We can think about search, talk to Ron Robertson in the back if you want to talk about search, newsfeed, social media, and that's what I'm going to focus on today is primarily about newsfeed, social media, but there are lots of other animals from WhatsApp to Reddit to Amazon, all of which have a role in this ecosystem and have different logics to them. But I'm going to focus primarily on the newsfeed, social media, but give a pretty stylized representation of newspapers and broadcast. So if we think about the evolution, as I'm trying to think big picture, and now I'm going to zoom in to into the details of our research, is that pre-internet, there was nationally an oligopoly in network news. There were local oligopolies in newspapers, local television and radio. Again, there were some connectivity among those outlets. There was a great deal. If you read the, let's say, Boston Globe from the 1990s, you would have seen a lot of news content, international and national news. They have bureaus in Moscow and London and elsewhere that they were producing. Right, you wouldn't see that now. The Globe, among other local papers, has eviscerated or essentially eliminated their international news coverage, greatly cut back on their national news production. But what we see, so that was sort of pre-internet. We had the national networks, we had local oligopolies in news production, and that meant that we got a lot of news, a lot of national, international news locally. Now, in terms of the internet, we have a lot of these residual structures. We still have a lot of these local papers. A lot of them have gone away. But there are some new outlets. There are obviously different kinds of ways of presenting information. But you can choose among these producers at the story level. If we're thinking of like, I'm going to use food. I was writing this initially when I was in Italy, and I had food on my mind a lot. And so if we think of what broadcast was like, in many ways, it's like a price-fixed menu. Like you're just going through the list of courses. You're going one after the other. There's not a lot of choice. You can choose what restaurant you go to, but then you sort of have that menu. If we think of newspapers as a way in which newspapers are like a buffet. Right? Most people don't read a newspaper cover. I mean, back when there was a physical paper. I still read a physical paper, but like when you read a physical paper, you don't read it literally cover to cover every story. You flip through, you read the headlines, you read the lead, and you decide to read some stuff and not others. Very much like you consume at a buffet, where you take a peek at everything and you're like, I'll have this dish, I'll skip that one. Right? But there's a way in which the internet should be envisioned as a buffet of buffets. You can literally pick dishes off of every table. Right? Again, there are nuances to this. There are paywalls. There are various kinds of blockages on the internet. But generally, you have a multitude of choices of outlets. And we're consuming from more outlets, and we're consuming in an a la carte kind of way. That is, we're getting a course off of different tables. And part of the interesting question is, how do we get access? There's a lot of courses out there. It's like more than we can scan. Like a newspaper is built to be just the right length, where we can flip through it in 20 minutes, scan every headline, and decide to read some stories and not to read most. And so what's the logic by which you scan all the world of information? Right? I think there is a sense that the key logic of the internet is creating competition among news producers at the story level, right? The internet partially decouples that consumption of news stories. It used to be that if you read one story about something in the New York Times, there's very high likelihood that you read very different stories from the New York Times as well. Well, that's not totally untrue now, but that reality is greatly depreciated. And the question of how news producers compete and what the social and algorithmic processes that structure the competition is sort of the key thing to wrestle with in terms of the contemporary internet. So if we're looking at prior research, I'm just giving you some exemplary citations. I'm going to talk about media concentration. It's interesting. There is like sort of an acknowledged fact that there's a lot of concentration, but I think and it was highlighted as a possibility or occurring pretty early on in internet research. I think Matt Hyman had coined the term Googlearchy, which not only gives a sense of the role of the top 10, but also tends to point the finger at Google, which I'm not sure is quite right. But there's a lot of research on media concentration, although again I'm not sure it's really gotten quite the unpacking that it should. Obviously, I've already discussed the sort of filter bubble, daily me kind of research. But then there's a sort of, again, reaction on we're really all consuming pretty diverse content. Liberal, somewhat more liberal, conservative, somewhat more conservative, but not radically different outlets. So what I'm going to argue is that choice has led to a concentration of consumption around a small number of outlets, and many people will choose multiple outlets. So that process of concentration and choosing multiple outlets makes the whole system look integrated, right? But there's also this curation process via social media and search that yields homogeneous choice patterns in terms of the types of stories that people read that does result in what we call a curation bubble. So I'm gonna walk through the empirics here. There are actually I'll just take the coat off altogether. Most of what I'm going to present here is from a matched panel of 1.6 million Twitter handles to voter data that my lab has been working with for a number of years. This matching process was developed in a science paper, Greenberg et al. In 2019. We were looking at the prevalence of misinformation on Twitter. And I'm happy to go into it more, but basically the basic logic of it is it relies on mutually geo-unique matches of names. So like David Lazer, Massachusetts, so that's a sort of triplet. That's unique in Twitter. It really is, right? There's no other David Lazars on Twitter from Massachusetts. And it turns out to be unique in the voter data too. So I would be a match. And so at the time, we probably matched roughly 4% of all US adults on Twitter that we've been collecting ongoing data from. And the nice thing is that we can then match it to partisanship. We're using target smart voter data, so we're using actually inferred partisanship, and I'm happy to talk about some of the implications of that. We also had a validation paper in Public Opinion Quarterly about different ways of creating panels. That was a Pew. We're collaborating with Pew to show if you did a survey-based sort of address-based sampling approach, how compared to our administrative data approach. It generally converged. There are some quirks that didn't dramatically change things, like some quirks in terms of exact match rates on gender versus race that differed across those approaches. But basically, they converged in the signals you got. But the nice thing is that you have the major advantage of the administrative data that we rely on right now is the scale. And so there's that question. Social sciences generally emphasize small, high quality samples, but there is a question of what do large samples provide you, right? And one of the key things large samples provide you, it's not the only thing, is it allows you to look at uncommon behaviors. And I'd argue that many, perhaps most, interesting behaviors are uncommon, right? So political science is often focused on who votes, how do you vote, and so on. Those are pretty common behaviors. Providing, who contributes to campaigns, that's actually a pretty uncommon behavior, especially if you're looking at the dollars, where it might literally be a very tiny number of people account for most of the dollars in politics. And so if we're thinking about sharing at the story level, like who shares this news story from the New York Times, it's actually a pretty uncommon behavior. And you can't really get much signal out of that if you had a sample size of a few thousand. So you really need a very large sample to look at stuff at the story level. So we're going to be looking at the story level. I'm going to do a sort of quantitative case study within all these data to look at COVID-19, to look at all the COVID-19 URLs being shared in the Twitter panel. And the reason why I'm looking at COVID is it has interesting international, national, local dimensions, and local decisions mattered a lot, so there's a reason to believe that locality should matter. And again, this is building on a few papers we had looking at COVID-related tweets. And so let's look at a question like how concentrated is sharing on Twitter at the domain level? Well, here, if we look nationally, we found the top 50 domains accounted for almost half of all shares on Twitter. They're all substantially domains that you would have heard of. The New York Times would be top, Washington Post, CNN, and so on. There are a few platforms that make it a little bit more complicated. YouTube, Instagram also appear in the top 10, but mostly these are news outlets that you would recognize, mainstream news outlets that people are consuming, it turns out, on the left and the right, as I'll show you. Interestingly, if you then separate this into like local domains versus national domains, local is if the preponderance of the content comes in one state, then the concentration gets even more acute. So like if we're looking at top 15 domains would now be 63%, would account for substantial majority of all content about COVID on Twitter. Zooming in on two states, I'm going to talk about Texas and New York. Similarly, if we look at national news domains in Texas, around 60% of the content in Texas comes from, 60% comes from the top 50 domains, and then the Texas content is even more concentrated. The top 50 domains account for 82% of Texas content. So there's like these two markets in Texas, the local stuff and the national stuff. They're both highly concentrated. Part of the reason when you aggregate it nationally, you do see this very long tail that goes on forever because you see all these local domains. You have Texas, New York, Idaho, Alaska. They all have local domains that are customized to their audiences. But what's interesting is if you look at, like, compare New York and Texas, for example, which are culturally quite different states, and I picked them because they're both big states, so we have a lot of signal, this is not great to see, but this is looking at the rank of the top 100 New York domains versus the top 100 domains. What one can see is that most of the points are like at the bottom, sort of in the bottom left-hand quadrant, which is like the most popular domains, that they're actually pretty similar in terms of what the top domains in New York and Texas are. And the ones that differ are, again, you can't see this so great, and I apologize, probably people online can see it better, but the top-ranked domains in Texas are like, that aren't in New York are like texas.gov, or the Houston or the Dallas News or the Houston Chronicle, and similarly in New York it might be the Gothamist or NYC.gov or NY.gov are popular in New York, non-Texas. No shock there, but what is striking is the general similarity in the top domains, and I'm going to zoom in here. Here are the top 10 New York domains, so New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Wall Street Journal. Top 10 Texas domains, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post. Then you get Houston Chronicle. You see Fox News ranks higher in Texas than it does in New York. Not surprising. You know, you do see the difference in conservative and liberal. But what is striking is that there is this convergence in news consumption between New York and Texas. And if we were thinking 20 years ago, there wasn't except for the national network news. There would not have been this sort of convergence in news consumption between New York and Texas, right? These are very different. They still are very different places. And so this again gets to the notion that there has been this homogenization in news consumption and nationalization of news consumption. Again, no tremendous news here, but it is a profound point to try to deeply understand. And then getting to other news-related consumption. This is work in part with Ron Robertson. We had an extension that collected browsing data, but also some within-platform data like Google Search and Google News. We actually have a paper coming out on some of this in a few months. That we could see, let's say, looking at browsing, top 100 sites accounted for 81% of the domains, search clicks, 71%, search results, actually a little less concentrated, 50, but still most in the top 100. Again, the Twitter stuff, looking at overall news was 87%, Google News clicks 80%. But the whole point here is the top 100 were like the domains were dominant. Again, and this is a much broader definition of news, and looking at within some of the platforms, within Google, especially in Twitter. So a lot of this sort of sets the context for the filter bubble patterns, because there are fewer sources of news. And if there are fewer sources of news, then naturally what we consume is going to start looking a lot more similar. That's why we saw New York and Texas look actually surprisingly similar. Surprisingly, I mean, maybe or maybe not to this audience, but in some sense, for looking at broader historical patterns, remarkably so. And so, so there is a sort of set of results saying, well, look, when we look at what people browse, they're all sort of looking at mainstream news sources. There's a lot of overlap between what Democrats and Republicans are looking at. There are some differences. We saw the Fox News being more popular in Texas, for example. But, actually notably similar. The similarities are striking, especially given the role that filter bubble discussion has played in popular discourse. So my argument, I need to fix that, is that there's a diversity of sources there's a diversity of sources where people are looking at, but a homogeneity of content that people are consuming. That the internet, as I noted, looks like a buffet of buffets, but this doesn't mean, just going to lots of buffet tables does not mean that you have a diverse diet, because you could walk away with a plate of donuts, right? And this does not look very diverse. And so part of the argument I'm going to make is that I'm not going to say this is exactly what's happening, but there's an element of walking away with a plate of donuts in democracy right now, right? And so this gets to the limitation of domain-level measures of diversity of news consumption. And this has been the dominant approach of measuring diversity of news consumption in the literature. And indeed, we see this is from our Twitter data, and we can come up with audience scores. -1 would mean only Democrats are consuming, and 1 would mean only Republicans are consuming the news out from that news outlet. And we see like The Nation is pretty much the furthest to the left. The National Review is very close to the extreme right. Something like the Wall Street Journal is really pretty close to the center. And so this is what our data look like, right? What the literature is saying. Well, people are actually, liberals are obviously getting more stuff on the left and more stuff, and conservatives more stuff on the right. But people are actually getting a fair degree of stuff from across this range. So like New York Times, shared more by Democrats. But when you look at the data at the story level, you see, there are a whole bunch of stories that are being shared by conservatives. And there seems to be a kind of pattern here, right? Like, I don't know, do people remember that needle from 2016 of like probability of Trump winning? Turns out that was much more popular among Republicans than Democrats on Twitter that night, election night, right? I don't know why, right? Or there was a very negative story about Adam Schiff. There was something about the Clinton Foundation. There's a whole bunch of stories here in the New York Times that are pretty appealing to Republicans. And then similarly, the National Review, which is like bookend right, shared way more by Republicans. It does turn out that there are some stories that Democrats like Trump's disgraceful endgame turned out to be very popular among Democrats, right? An epidemic of dishonesty on the right was atypically shared by liberals. House Judiciary Democrat says Kavanaugh will likely be investigated for perjury, right? Again, much more popular among Democrats. So you do see like hints of like, what's going on here, right? And the general argument, empirical point, is like if there's a homogeneous process of like consumption and sharing patterns, we should sort of see this pretty neat normalish distribution, right? That if every story that's being produced should be like is drawing from the bin and should be like roughly speaking, given some noise, should be like look like every other story from the outlet. But our argument is that there will often be these curation bubbles of audiences atypical for that outlet that may be that will be drawing that will make the distribution of homogeneity at the outlet level clearly wrong, and so at the domain level, this would look like people are consuming diverse content. But at the story level, this would mean that there's a sort of curation process where people may be consuming content that largely same partisans are consuming. And all this builds, there are ample psychological mechanisms why you might anticipate this would occur. That clearly people are actively curating. People aren't just randomly choosing who to follow on Twitter, on social media. They're actively deciding who to follow based on what they see as being shared. We know that partisans tend to selectively focus on news that's favorable to their side, and are more likely to share content that is favorable to their in-group. And you put that all together, and it sort of sets up the micro foundations of a curation process on newsfeed. Social media. And so, we have this, constructing the partisan scores, again, the -1 to 1, -1 being most liberal, 1 being most conservative. And we can look at, our large-scale data set, we can look at the diversity of the audience scores of every story and compare that to the outlet more generally. And so what we did, and this is we started this in some time ago. So we're looking at domain URLs shared in 2017 and 2018. We removed URLs that were shared fewer than 10 times. Still means there's a fair amount of noise at the URL level. I wish our data were even bigger than they are. But it still results in 1.4 million unique URLs, and we can calculate partisanship scores for every URL and every domain. And then we can identify what our political. I can go into this more if you want. But generally our results at the domain level, they look like prior research. They look sensible in terms of like the audience scores at the domain level, like I showed the New York Times, somewhat left-leaning, National Review hard right, The Nation hard left, and so on. And so what do our results look like? Well, I'm going to give you. Just some examples of this is from the New York Times. What you see in the New York Times is, that the large bulk of the stories looks sort of normalish, but then you do have this rightward tilt of stories that appeals much more on the right, which hypothetically are curation bubbles, and I'll talk about the statistics underneath this in a moment. Similarly, the National Review, going back to that story, we see there's this sort of few handfuls of stories that appealed to liberals from the National Review, even though the bulk of it was very conservative in audience. What we see is if we simulate, if you can simulate what the diversity would look like if it was a homogeneous process producing sharing of URLs. If, let's say, every National Review story had this level of conservatism, every New York Times story had a certain level of liberalism, and what we see is the black line with the shade around it is what you'd expect, roughly speaking, if it was a homogeneous process. And what we see is the dots are largely not in that range, and that the bulk of the outlets are actually looking highly curated, that is, they have way more variance than they should. And I'll give you some of the particular examples. It's a little tight here. You can see, I can give you an example of the best fit and worst fit. So like the Blaze, it turns out, liberals never, there's no evidence of curation. The Blaze is a very hard right online website. It's a very homogeneous process. It's conservatives sharing content for conservatives, and liberals never go, oh, I want to share something from the Blaze. That's the best fit of any of the domains that we look at. The worst is Mediaite, which sort of purposely chooses red meat content for left and right. And what you get is this very pronounced bimodal distribution. And so to describe Mediaite as a middle of the road outlet would be really inaccurate, right? It's left and right, but there's nothing in the middle. Interestingly, actually, also if you look at the bottom left, the Wall Street Journal is something like that too, and it sort of totally makes sense if you think about the editorial process at the Wall Street Journal, right? You have the news, and you have the editorial page, which is very right-wing. And then you have others that are sort of more in the middle. Fox News, actually not a terrible fit. Washington Post and New York Times have sort of these left bulk of their audience, but they have this right shoulder of content. But generally, most of the large bulk of the domains are very different. They have much more heterogeneity than you'd expect. Now, on the to-do list is still hand coding of individual stories to confirm the causal story or the process that I'm discussing, which is, do those stories really appeal? I gave you some anecdotes to begin with, but does that hold up if we hand coded thousands of stories and say, does this appeal to liberals? Does this appeal to conservatives? So that's to be done. The other thing is, and Nate will be happy to hear this, is that we're replicating this with the Facebook URL data, because the URL data are like perfectly designed for this research question, because the URL data from Social Science 1 have the partisanship of every URL, and so you could calculate whether they're different from each other, given the noise that's added. And the answer is yes, but we've run into like little quirks, but it's actually every domain looks curated on Facebook. It's like a lot better signal with the Facebook data. So the nice thing is that this replicates across 2 newsfeed platforms. I'm going to actually skip this. The answer is just the conclusion here is that in a sense in the status quo ante we had local concentration, we had national diversity of news outlets, individual homogeneity in news consumption, because you'd be consuming from very few news outlets. And in a sense, most people lived in these parochial bubbles, right? And now we have the local decimation papers, less national diversity due to concentration, lots of heterogeneity in news consumption at the domain level, and cosmopolitan. We're all in bubbles still, but we're in cosmopolitan national news bubbles, much more so than local. We're in bubbles, but they're cosmopolitan rather than parochial. So that's sort of what I conclude as sort of the emergent structure of the information ecosystem. I'm going to spend one more minute, because I know I've gone over, because that's what I do. I apologize. Professorial problems. But one of my big efforts over the last few years is to build something called the National Internet Observatory. This is with the big assistance of a $15.7 million NSF grant. The idea is to create shared data that are accessible about online experiences, but while maintaining privacy of people who volunteer their data. And so we are creating this large ongoing panel of data of collection where we look over participants' shoulders to see what happens when they ask Google questions, or what does Facebook show them, what does Twitter show them, and then provide analytic access to qualified researchers from wherever, but with under data use agreement, under various a whole layer of privacy protection, so that researchers can look at what people are doing on the internet, look within platforms, and because this research is expensive, right? Like most of the research in this space is bespoke projects, data collection that can't get shared because of the privacy and security issues in sharing the data. And the idea here is to have for us to deal with the massive fixed costs of creating a really powerful data set that's multi-platform, with diverse participants, that then researchers from around the country and around the world can use. So I'm not going to go through all my other slides and the details of this, although they are there if you have questions. But I'm very excited about this prospect. Part actually, again, builds pointing to Ron, but in the back, but in part builds on work that Ron did in the lab back years ago, in that 2018 and 2020 data collection, that we're trying to do that now as a one-off data collection with hundreds of participants, but to do that with tens of thousands of participants in an ongoing way that's available to qualified researchers. So I'll end there, and again, thanks very much for listening patiently.
Let me just start with a data question, which is, you're measuring shares.
Yes.
As opposed to exposure. Now, right? do you think there's but you're making an argument really about exposure,
yeah,
and using shares as a kind of proxy for that. And so the thing we worry, the echo chamber phenomenon, right, is what are we seeing something that's confirming our beliefs? And so my guess is the group of people who hypothesis here is that the group of people who share news might not be the same as the group of people who consume news. I don't know whether you have any. I mean, now with what Twitter's doing with its exposure data, we might be able to get better information on that. But am I missing something here? Is it possible that you'll just say, well, actually, if you look at exposure, it shows the same things?
If you look at exposure, it shows the same things.
Okay.
I can say that because of the Facebook URL data. So
okay.
Thanks to you in part.
All right. Good.
So
I was just lofting that one up.
I appreciate that, but it's not to say it shows identical things. It's actually, I think, less extreme on exposure. To the extent there's some issues because of the noise added to the data, make it a little hard to make those inferences. But looks like it's a little less pronounced, but it's definitely still there if you look at exposure data on Facebook. But you're right, in the Twitter data, we're only looking at sharing behavior.
Just because, I mean, that's critical, right, to the argument, just to make sure. The second question is more of a meta question. If the truth is, I can never say that now in a social media talk that we used to. And that is one of the sort of the changes over time from the late 1800s is that it's now harder to determine what is news, right? And so, I mean, the part of the thing that I'm not sure I'm hearing here is the social part of social media, and by that I mean the fact that it's harder and harder to distinguish news, right? One of the things that makes Twitter and Facebook different than the nightly news, we knew when we were going and watching nightly news, we knew picking up a newspaper, but when you read Facebook, you have a New York Times story right above a Beyonce music video, right above your nephew's graduation picture, stuff like that. And so part of the challenge here is to figure out whether news is also coming at you in sort of very different ways, right? So that because you're not going to pick up on political content that my friends are sharing with me that doesn't refer to a domain, right?
Yes, so that's right. So what is missing from the method, and I think this is definitely a shortcoming of the method, is that there's a lot of kibitzing about politics, and that in principle could be detectable, although it's hard. It's much easier when you start out with the URLs, and we are missing the kibitzing that could be conveying like statements about the facts about the world that we're just not capturing with our methodology.
But also that the URLs that are, so how do you, you've looked at URLs that you have predetermined are news URLs, right? And then that's
right,
what
using the blurb. So there's
right.
we have a sort of methodology for classifying what's news, because not everything from a given domain is news. So we were, and then for the COVID stuff, we were looking at frankly just a set of keywords around COVID. So we had sort of reasonable but imperfect methods for classifying content as news or as COVID, but that was relying on the information that was embedded within the URL and wasn't for the news part. For the COVID part, we were actually relying on keywords within the tweet to classify then the URLs. Do
you have a sense? This is a kind of Jenskowish argument here. Part of the argument about filter bubbles has been that, our news consumption online might be more diverse, more heterogeneous, right? Get exposed to different sources, because we all have that crazy uncle in our news feed who we otherwise wouldn't, only would talk to at Thanksgiving. Or that basically the news we consume online is very similar to the news we consume offline. So how different do you think what you're observing here is different from the sort of offline behavior in terms of the kind of confirmatory signal, how homophilous it is?
Good question. I think there are a few things going on there. In other research that I didn't show you, we're looking at how concentrated attention is on, say, Twitter. Turns out it's very concentrated, and so there's a way in which, look, a two-step flow, which is like the idea that there's this pretty well-established idea in comm around two-step flow, which is that I hear stuff, sometimes directly, but more often I hear stuff from someone else who heard something, right? There's classic work, let's say, looking at how people heard about JFK's assassination. Most people heard it about it from somebody, not about it on the news, because somebody heard it and then they started telling people. The interesting thing there is that, in a way, what makes social media so remarkable is that it amplifies the effect of that two-step process, because it does turn out, from our research, is that you can be followed by many people on Twitter. Facebook is an interesting, different story, because there it's more about pages. It's sort of like the role of hubs, informational hubs on Facebook, I think. But that you have the curation process is much more acute on social media, especially when something like Twitter or pages on Facebook, where you can choose something because it's compatible. I think our friends, and I've done research on social networks, I've done a lot of research on social networks, and generally, even though there's a lot of evidence of political homophily in social networks, that certainly my research suggests we don't choose our friends or relationships based in politics. And so there are multiple things that make social media very special in a way that creates this sort of curation process that just didn't really exist in social, like people-to-people networks before social media.
But the curation, ultimately, you want to say the curation process is leading liberals to to be more likely, you to at least gravitate toward liberal stories, right?
Yes. So I think that there's in a macro sense, the structures that are emergent does lead liberals to get liberal content, sometimes from surprising places. Yeah. They don't have to go to The Nation. They can get liberal content from the National Review. Right. Talk about a technological miracle, right? So there is this sort of macro structure of the network that gets content, like-minded content, to people, often from surprising places, and so that's the core argument.
I want to open up to people in the room, but I have some questions that we just got on from the Zoom audience. The first is from Bruce Crawford, who asks sort of whether you think some of this, what I'm going to call cross-posting, but like liberals seeing a National Review article, how much of it is of the type that you suggested, where liberals are, seeing liberalish stories on National Review as opposed to, oh my God, look what this is saying, right? So that, I don't know what we call that, counter posting, outrage posting, that kind of thing. Do you have,
hate posting in a way.
Maybe,
right?
Yeah.
See how crazy the other side is?
Right.
And certainly, anecdotally, I can say,
we all see
that, right? Judging from, the hand coding we've done, the vast bulk of it is not that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But like TBD, that's not a citable thing, so don't say Lazer.
Well, I think that's probably right.
My sense from what we've, just giving you an anticipation of what we've seen in the data.
Yeah. The thing that surprised me actually is what seemed like kind of symmetry on the left and right here, because Shanta Iyengar's work and some others have suggested that really, if there is a filter bubble, it's on the left, that right-leaning folks are more likely to get, because there's such concentration of media enterprises on the right, that inevitably a right-leaning person is going to end up consuming New York Times, but that a left-leaning person is not going to be consuming Fox News. But you don't seem to.
I didn't show you that. There was a figure I skipped over at the end, but I was looking at sort of the typical distribution of news audiences for people on the left, for Democrats versus Republicans. What we see is, and how it changes if you looked at the domain level versus URL level. And what we see is, first of all, that there are a lot of Republicans who get content from quote-unquote liberal audiences because most of the mainstream stuff leans left in terms of audience. And so it's inevitable that some people on the Republican side will do New York Times stories, whereas the Fox News, like I said, Fox News would be the biggest source on the right. Turns out to be very, very little, but very, very little curation of Fox. And so you do see, it does look as if Democrat, and also Twitter, the other thing to note is Twitter at least until recently, was predominantly left-leaning. In terms of the users of Twitter, much more Democratic than Republican. And so it's very easy to live in a liberal Democratic bubble on Twitter. Much harder to not have some of that content. Still, there were some. There's definitely a right bubble on Twitter, and that right bubble looks much larger if you look at URL level measures as compared to domain level.
So what's the bottom line here, though? I mean, to what extent do you think most people are living in filter bubbles at the URL level, right? Or at the story level?
I would say, the evidence is, on Twitter, on the sharing level, that that a lot of people, maybe most, live in a pretty homogeneous informational environment. So I'd say it's a pretty substantial pattern empirically, but that there are actually a fair number of Republicans who actually have more stuff with audiences that lean left than there are Democrats who have. There are very few Democrats who are right of zero.
All right, let me do one last one from the Zoom audience, and then anyone should raise their hands. Actually, I've got two. Now I'm getting a lot more. All right. Isadora asks, well, this is an observatory question. Well, let me. Yeah. All right. Well, let's ask this. Is the observatory anticipating any issues like what the NYU team has encountered with Facebook? If not, how have they been able to sidestep their opposition to having the platform Black Box Pride open? I don't know if that's.
I think that's a real anxiety. So ask me in a year or so. Obviously we're very anxious about that. I do think that
maybe we should explain what the NYU problem is. So the ad observatory. The question is about scraping. I assume so. If you're doing data contribution and you're wanting people to essentially turn over their Facebook feeds, that may violate the terms of service. And so, can you actually scrape that data and put it into a public repository? So
we're trying to get some derivatives of it. So, like for example, you could see what URLs people saw and so on. So the question is, if we're making derivatives of that available, will companies like Meta object? And that's an empirical question. I don't think the NYU experience was a good one for Meta. I think that got a lot of negative press, rightfully so. And the question is, for a company like Meta, what is their judgment going forward, given also the layers of protection around these data and so on. So there's a lot of privacy protection. We have a big ethics board. We have a lot of security around it. And so there is a sort of question of what the actual project is and the kinds of security around it. So.
Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is, another space where we see this distinction between domains and stories pop up is in research on people's exposure and sharing to bad content, like misinformation or conspiratorial content, QAnon websites, what have you. So here you demonstrate kind of what happens when you actually break them apart in terms of the partisanship of the content compared to its users. What are your thoughts on implications of this distinction for, we just care, are people exposed to bad content or not? Maybe less of where partisanship is not playing such a central role. Obviously, we know there's more work to do there. We can get more specific, but it's hard work. And some of the automated labeling is inaccurate. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's hard. And I say that as someone who made a case in Grunberg et al. We made the case that we should be looking to domain level stuff. And I actually think that for some purposes, domains make a lot of sense. Like if you want to understand, if you're trying to make a judgment about the editorial process, so like part of our argument around fake news was that it was a judgment about the editorial process of an outlet. And so we could talk about whether, really is about the signal value of an outlet. So just like a clock might be right, a broken clock might be precisely right twice a day and approximately right other times, that its signal value is 0. And so I think that there's still, for misinformation, a lot of value at the outlet, making these decisions at the outlet level, and for that matter, even on the audience scores, I think there's value. It's just that, it really does matter what the misinformation is and who's exposed to it and so on. So like if it's anti-vax content, we really want to know it's anti-vax content, not just that you read something from a website that we consider misinformation. So the answer is ideally we do both. It's obviously pretty arduous to do a URL or story by story. It's even harder to make a story by story judgment. Much harder about the truth value of a story. So that's tough. That doesn't precisely answer. It's just mainly it's a hard thing. And if people could introduce themselves as you ask questions, that would be great. Great.
Hi, my name is Ulysses Delatorre. I just wanted to know how do you define when something has gone viral versus something that's just been shared a lot?
Well, I guess there are a few ways of doing it. One, for common language, often it's really synonymous. I'd say, as a network scholar, I would tend to talk about the diffusion tree, like what the structure of the tree looks like, and whether it's if it's a deep tree, if it goes many layers, versus something that's just excuse me, just a big explosion because like a node, a famous person shared it and a lot of people saw it. It's something that got a lot of exposure, which quote unquote which was shared once but seen a lot, versus a tree which is much deeper, where two people told two people told two people and so on. There's been some very cool work here by Johan Ugander, for the folks who know him, on tree structures and diffusion. But like if we were really trying to push, I'd say viral would be when you have many layers to the tree and many people sharing it, rather than just a few and mainly coming from, say, one or two people.
Well, no, we got to go to the last question over here. Sorry.
Hi there, thank you. Emma Lurie. I'm a PhD JD candidate here. I'm curious, in the research, we really still are seeing so much domain level partisan scoring. Yeah. And I think you provide a really compelling example of the Wall Street Journal, right, where like we see in all these papers, it's scored as close to 0 or 0. Are there ways to, with the idea that domain level scoring isn't going away, to kind of complicate or add nuance as like a method? I don't know if that's something you guys have given thought to.
Yeah, Russell, I don't have a great answer for that one either, because like I guess part of it has to be how much do this heterogeneity within domains, does it matter for your research question? If it matters a lot, it's hard to escape from unless you're looking at, let's say, a subset of domains which are pretty homogeneous in process. Like I mentioned, obviously the Blaze is the sort of central example, but like you could see, Fox is pretty homogeneous and so on. So do we see, if you have big enough data where you can do URL level stuff, great. The problem is that that's tough. It's very demanding to have that much data. And this is part of why, it would be great to have more systems that had large scale enough data which were widely accessible to researchers, so you could do URL level stuff. But I do think that number one, as a researcher, you have to evaluate how big a problem is that heterogeneity. It may not matter much for you. Number two might be to look at subsets of the data where we know the domains are more homogeneous. We'll when we get this out, we'll have the distribution overlap scores for all the domains, and so you'll be able to see at least circa our data, and we'll probably update it as well so that you can see how heterogeneous the sharing patterns were, and that may inform future research. Actually, the Facebook URL data are there already, so there's a lot of data already to evaluate how much heterogeneity there is and how much of a problem it is for the domains, and there may be some way of working out a way to save the domain level stuff for some purposes and not others.
Well, thank you so much. Next week, we've got our own Becca Lewis here, who's an expert on, I would say, all things influencer, as well as all kinds of, studying of new platforms, TikTok, et cetera. But please join me in thanking Professor David Lazer.
Thank you.